thank you to Ronan and to April and to the organisers, and just to commend you and congratulate you on launching Education Equality. I think it's a really important campaign. I'm delighted to be here, and I know we have allies, as you've said, from the Humanist Association, Educate Together and Equate, all here. And I think there is a real momentum now around the issue of equality in education. And long overdue, and you've heard something about that already from April and from Nikki. I should say my own personal reasons for being involved in the campaign generally for education equality now for many years are, first of all, as a child, like most of you probably here, I was sent to a local Catholic national school in which we were instilled with the fear of hellfires and so forth. I won't go into it because I know there are children here, but certainly it wasn't very far from a compassionate faith formation in rural Cork at the time. And I suppose that, and as a child, parents were sceptical at best about religion. I certainly know what it feels like to be the child at the back of the room who isn't quite part of the faith formation class, and it's a very tough place to be as a child. I suppose then as an academic I became interested in the theory of this, in researching the legal basis for the discrimination that we see in the sectarian basis of our education system. I'll talk a little more about that in a moment, and I know Owen will also speak on that. But I suppose most strongly I became involved in this 5 years ago as a parent of two preschool children then, who are now 7 and 9, and so a little older than many of the children who it's so lovely to see here. But like Nikki, we were refused. I was trying to remember as you spoke about how many schools I applied to in the local area and way beyond the local area, my local area of Dublin 8 in Portobello. We went for north side schools, south side schools. We got rejections from I think about 12 or 13 schools that I applied to in increasing panic. One school secretary, meaning to be helpful, said to me, "Ivana, whatever you do, don't write down atheist as the religion of your children, because you will be bottom of every list for every school." And she was trying to be helpful. And she was in Secretary General of a C of I school. We found this was true of Catholic and Protestant schools. Schools under religious patronage generally were very difficult to see us getting places there. And the local Educate Together schools, and there are two in our area, were hugely oversubscribed with massive waiting lists. So 5 years ago, as a result of that, a group of us set up a local campaign, and as Nikki said, we expected a small number of people. We got very quickly a huge groundswell of support in the local area. We put our energies into setting up a multi-denominational school and into what was then the start of the National Forum on Patronage and Pluralism in the Primary Sector under Professor John Coonahan. We were very involved in that in the local Portobello Educate Together, and we did succeed eventually in getting a school. In fact, I think still the first and one of the perhaps two only divestments that has taken place of a Catholic school. It opened in September 2013, Canal Way Educate Together in Dublin 8, and it's a hugely thriving school now. But over the period of time I've been involved in the campaign, I've seen just how difficult it is to challenge the status quo, and just how difficult it is to see the process of divestment being rolled out. And again, I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But I think just to say something about the basis for this and the reason why we have the system we have. April started with a famous quote from a speech. I'm going to start this section by just mentioning a key article of the Constitution, Article 42(3)(1), which provides that the state shall not oblige parents in violation of their conscience and lawful preference to send their children to schools established by the state or to any particular type of school designated by the state. And the article also requires the state to have due regard for the rights of parents, particularly in the matter, or especially in the matter of religious and moral formation. So there is in the Constitution a guarantee that parents should not be obliged to, in violation of their conscience and lawful preference, to send children to particular types of school. And yet, as we've heard, 96% of education provision at primary level is under religious patronage, 90% under the patronage of the Catholic Church. We have 3,200 approximately national schools in Ireland, 3,200, 74, am I right, Paul? 74 now are Educate Together, multi-denominational. 77, thank you, I should have double checked. And the speed of the pace of change has escalated. I mean, the numbers, I gave I remember I looked at our submission to the forum back in 2011, and there were 58 Educate Together primary schools then. So certainly the pace of change has been fast, but it's still a drop in the ocean, 74 out of 3,200. So the reality is that there are many parents, as we know, who are obliged in violation of conscience and lawful preference to send their children to schools in which religious instruction is offered in a faith which they do not believe in. How is this permitted to happen? It's an untenable situation. Why has a case not happened? I've said before, it's a case waiting to happen, and lawyers generally would agree that there is litigation waiting to happen. In fact, some years ago, as a practicing barrister, I had clients who wished to take such a case. They went on the Late Late Show to speak about their own experience, and we were at the point of initiating litigation when their circumstances changed and they got a place in a different school. And at that point, it's very, very hard for parents to challenge the status quo, especially where you have a child who has started in a school. You don't want to put that child in a position of contesting the school that they're in. It's a very, very difficult thing. So, most parents do give up and put up, as I've said. They give up and they put up, and that's why the status quo remains. But acquiescence is not support. Just because so many parents are baptising children or sending children to religious schools and in which they're receiving faith formation in a faith they don't believe in, just because of that doesn't actually imply support for the system. And I was interested to see the Equate opinion polls that we saw just this week. 84% of people want reform of admissions policy. Clear majorities, up to 87% wanting to see reform of the current system and a change to this religious dominance of our schooling system. The difficulties, though, are immense in challenging it. It's not just the sense that parents have of not wanting to rock a boat once a child is in school. It's also the fact that the school system itself is so, it's about the ownership of the school system itself. We know that while the state pays the bulk of building and running costs, the teachers' salaries, the schools are national schools, for most of those of the schools under religious patronage. But the schools themselves, the buildings, are almost all privately owned, in general by the relevant church authorities. And the Education Act of 1998, of course, preserves the system of patronage, so the patron, in most cases the local Catholic bishop, or else the local religious patron, or indeed in a small number of cases other groups like Educate Together. These patrons therefore have huge power, and it's the majority of patrons which own the schools. So in reality, the distinction between public and private education in Ireland is rather blurred. We may describe these as national schools, but as April has said, the education system really should be described more accurately as semi-public or state-aided, rather than fully public, and indeed rather than state-owned. And in terms of education children receive, during the school day, religions dominate. So, what does it matter if a school's under religious patronage? Parents may ask, and one principal in our endless search for a school, one principal of a Catholic school said to me, our school is really more multi-denominational than most of the Educate Togethers. And I said, oh really? Well, why don't you give some of your school over then to a multi-denominational patron? And she looked at me in the eye and said, because the state couldn't afford to take us on. So it was again, a helpful comment which illustrated to me the depth of the challenge facing those who wish to change the system. The local, in that case, religious order owned the school, and it was just going to be too costly for the state or for any multi-denominational grouping to seek to take on the ownership and patronage of the school. So what does it matter? Does it matter? It does matter because, as we heard, we know that in the ethos of Catholic schools, it's required that a religious spirit should permeate the entire school day. This is supported in the rules for national schools, as you've heard, and Rule 68 of which provides that of all parts of the school curriculum, religious instruction is by far the most important. Religious instruction is therefore a fundamental part of the school course, and a religious spirit should inform and vivify the whole work of the school. That's the rule that happily Minister O'Sullivan has now announced she will abolish in January. There has been an immense backlash against that announcement. It's received a great deal of support, of course, and it is hugely welcome and long overdue, but there's been a backlash against it too, and let's be mindful of that as well. Teachers themselves, we should also not forget the difficulties for teachers who must teach religious instruction according to the religion of the school, whatever their own personal beliefs. Teachers' unions have called for change, but we know that teacher training itself is organised in a denominational fashion. So there's huge obstacles to overcome. So I don't want to end on a negative note. How do we change it? Well, clearly organisations like this new organisations, new groups are hugely important in changing it. And we've already seen, just in the last 2 weeks, really huge change occurring. The announcement on Rule 68 is hugely welcome, and we've just seen that this week. The week before, we saw finally passed into law the bill to amend Section 37 of the Employment Equality Act, which, as many of you will know, was the section that permitted schools to discriminate against teachers on the basis of their lifestyle, if it was so-called offended the religious ethos of the school. So we've changed that. We have made it almost impossible now for schools to discriminate on that basis, and we're going to abolish Rule 68. What other ways to change? Well, I think there are 3 approaches that need to be taken. I spoke about the National Forum on pluralism, on patronage and pluralism in the primary sector. That report is well worth reading. It still offers a blueprint for change, but what it requires is real political will and energy to implement it. The divestment process was perhaps the biggest sort of story, the biggest headline out of it. But that clearly was only to apply in places where there were a number of schools, in places like Dublin or urban centres. And divestment, the idea was that local Catholic patrons, where they saw that there were dwindling numbers of parents who believed in that area, they would divest to multi-denominational bodies or other bodies where parents wanted. So it was about respecting parental choice. Divestment is still a real option in terms of trying to achieve change and trying to change patrons. That has to be proceeded with as well. But clearly more pressure needs to be put on the Church, on the Catholic Church in particular, and on religious bodies about that. Secondly, more needs to be done for what John Coonan in the report called standalone schools, the primary schools which are the only school in an area where there isn't an option to divest. In those situations, we need to see faith formation classes move to the end of the day, and I think you're right to point that out, and proper accommodation made for children of minority religion or no religion. And the abolition of Rule 68 is a very important way to do that. First step in that. I should say that the report also offers other really positive and practical ways to address that. But finally, I think this campaign is hugely important because it's focusing now on a third point, which is the admission to schools and the amendment to the Equal Status Act to ensure that schools can no longer discriminate on the basis of religion in admission policy. I know Owen's going to speak more on that, but I think that's a really important part of the campaign. But clearly there's a great deal more to be done. Many of us would like, myself included, would like to see us move to an entirely secular system of state-run education, whereas in Sweden, in the church you preach, in the school you teach, you shouldn't mix the two. And that's the model we have in Educate Together schools. But I recognise the huge difficulties we have in challenging religious ownership of school buildings. And that is the biggest obstacle to that sort of huge fundamental change. And I think in the meantime we need to focus on those issues, investment, on the accommodation in religious run schools, but in particular on changing the admission policy. We'll be putting it certainly in the Labour manifesto for the next election, and I should say that I think it will happen. I think the momentum is there. Others have spoken about, April has spoken about the marriage equality referendum, the hugely positive change in that, transgender legislation. There's been, I think we can say, a quiet and peaceful social revolution in terms of social attitudes to change. We see it in the opinion polls on repeal of the 8th Amendment, and I think we see it also in the polls I mentioned in respect of education equality. But this is a bastion of discrimination that remains, and we do have to challenge it, and I know all of you will work, as I will, tirelessly to try and achieve that. Thank you.